Well, good afternoon, fellow Earthlings. Here we are in Irvine, California, planet Earth, surrounded by trillions of stars and trillions of planets. And sometimes when we can actually see the stars, we're reminded that we are all living on one small planet surrounded by a vast universe of wonder and mystery. And we're also reminded sometimes that we have some very important unanswered questions, like, what is our human place in the universe? Are we humans alone in the universe? Who are we humans really? And those questions lie at the core of the reasons for having an internationally supported mission to send humans to Mars. And if we do that, it will help solve one of the biggest problems we have on this planet, and that is we have way too much violence based on superficial differences in human identity. And an international Humans to Mars mission will help solve that problem because it will encourage worldwide science education. It will cultivate a global human identity core based on science. And it will help us stop wasting so much money on anti-human weaponry. And it will give us all a new look at the reality of the human place in the universe. And in the end, it could be a journey to peace and knowledge for all humanity. And this is based on the fact that we humans have a strong urge to understand the universe, to know. And sometimes it's so strong that we use our imaginations to fill in our knowledge gaps. We fill them in with conflicting supernatural beliefs and religions, which we add to our human identities. And those often are different because they're based on our imagination. And I think it's rather ironic that Mars is named after the Roman god of war. Perhaps we should change that to Pax, the Roman goddess of peace. And the answer to all of this is science, because it's based on evidence and creates a unifying human identity core. Now, what is human identity? Well, it's made up of many different factors, but some of the major ones are gender, race, language, nationality, religion, age, and our place in the universe. And Amartya Sen from India is one of several authors who have written books about this problem of identity and violence. He wrote his book in 2006. The title was Identity and Violence. And what his basic summary is that violence is caused by illusions of human identity. And this is backed up by a 2014 Pew report that shows there's religion-related terrorism in 82 nations of the world, and that's 41% of all nations. And of course, religion is a part of a lot of people's identity. And he says the solution is to see ourselves as planetary citizens. In other words, see our commonality. Now, Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics back in 1979, made a comment that gets at the core of this matter. He said that the effort to understand the universe is one of the few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce. And we humans do engage in a lot of escapisms in order to avoid facing reality. And the good news is that when we make a decision to do something like exploring our next door neighbor planet Mars in order to discover something new about our human identity, there will be some benefits that are immediate. And how some of those benefits can be immediate is explained by Nathaniel Brandon in his republished book of 2001, where he basically summarizes that we get a boost in our self-esteem when we use our minds to the fullest to face reality. We feel better when we face reality and use our minds to deal with it. And one of the best ways to use our minds to the fullest is to use the results of science. And that can be done in basically three ways. One is to predict and influence nature to produce life-enhancing technology. And of course, we've done that to a huge extent. We're surrounded by technology, including computers to help us think better. And now we have some robots doing some work that we don't want to do. A second way is to produce weapons to threaten or kill other humans. And unfortunately, we're doing that to a huge extent. And the third way is the way that science was invented several centuries ago, when it was invented in order to search for human meaning and identity. But unfortunately, that's kind of been pushed aside lately in favor of the first two. However, I've noticed some resurgence in using science to search for human meaning and identity lately. And a good example of that resurgence is a book entitled Science and the Quest for Meaning. It's written by Alfred Tauber, who is the Boston University professor of philosophy, and he's also the director of their History of Science program. And in that book, he wrote that the role of science in defining personal identity cannot be overemphasized. In other words, we need to become more aware of how science affects our human identity and perhaps focus on it. At least focus on it more. And Verner von Braun, as you know, was the brilliant rocket scientist that designed the Saturn V rocket that sent us to the moon in 1969. He had something to say about this too. He said that by going into outer space, we will find ourselves. In other words, by exploring beyond our own planet, we will discover something new about our human identity. Now, what does exploring Mars have to do with our human identity? Well, I think one of the main points is that if we were to discover a DNA life form on Mars, that would mean we're probably related to it, could have descended from it, and in a sense, we could even be Martians. On the other hand, if we were to discover a non-DNA life form on Mars, that would be some indication that other life forms have evolved commonly throughout the universe, and perhaps some of them into advanced civilizations. And of course, our identity has a powerful influence on how we behave. We behave according to who we think we are and what we think we can do. Now, many times after giving this presentation, people have said, well, before we waste money on sending humans to Mars, we need to solve problems here on Earth. I've heard that several times. But my point here is, by exploring Mars with an internationally supported mission, we will solve some problems here on Earth. And my response is basically, before we waste more money on anti-human weaponry, let's cooperate and go to Mars and reduce some of this ridiculous conflict that we have going on in the world today. And this is kind of an example here of how we need to change our priorities. The military received 16% of the US federal budget in 2016, and that is a very conservative estimate. And NASA only got 0.49%. In other words, we need to change our priorities some way or another. And another way of looking at how much priority we put into space exploration is look at the salary of the NASA acting administrator. He gets $185,000 a year. Well, that's a decent salary, isn't it? But look at the salary of Brett Bielema, the Arkansas football coach. He gets over $4 million, and I live in the same town where he does that. On the other hand, look at the salary of Nick Saban, the Alabama football coach. He gets over $11 million a year. And the point is, if we were this interested in exploring our next door neighbor planet Mars to discover something new about our human place in the universe, we would already be there on Mars. And football is just an escapism, in my opinion. So we need to change our priorities. Now, way back in 1960, Marshall McLuhan saw all these communication satellites being launched around the world and interconnecting the world with instantaneous global communication. And he coined the term global village. That was back in 1960. And we are now kind of living in a global village in a sense. And the astronaut Edgar Mitchell kind of confirmed this concept in a different way. He said that seeing the Earth from space produced instant global consciousness, and I came back to Earth no longer an American citizen, but a planetary citizen. And several other astronauts have expressed the same thought, including one from Saudi Arabia. And the astronomer Jill Tarter, about 3 years ago, she made the comment that we are all Earthlings. We owe it to each other to celebrate our commonality rather than our perceived differences. That's a good concept. And it's a common concept with people who think about what lies beyond the Earth. Now, John Logsdon wrote a book entitled John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. In 2010, he wrote that book. And he uncovered some surprising facts. I found it surprising anyway. He found that Kennedy was actually negotiating with Khrushchev to have a project that would send representatives of all nations to the moon with a global approach to space exploration. We seem to have forgotten that. But unfortunately, he was assassinated, and we ended up in just a race between the US and the Soviets. And when we got there to the moon, we planted the US flag. But what I'm saying here is it would have been much more beneficial to all humanity and wiser and more diplomatic to all nations if we had planted the flag of Earth when we landed on the moon, just as these guys are doing here at the South Pole in the Antarctica. They planted the flag of Earth there. Now, the Reverend Dr. Fraser Watts, a professor of theology and science, back in 2012 said, religion is associated with culture and identity and is a source of tension. Keeping in mind he is a reverend, he also said, science is the most genuinely international movement in the world order and therefore a force for peace and stability. And a good example of that is the Large Hadron Collider located near Geneva, Switzerland, has 60 different nations supporting it. And about 3 years ago, they announced that they found the fundamental particle of the universe, the Higgs boson particle. And this kind of knowledge will allow all humanity to better understand how the universe actually works from a scientific viewpoint. Now, on the other hand, we humans compete in many different ways. There's been global competition in products and labor now for several decades. And there's competition for NASA contracts, but I need to point out that most of those contracts are paid for by governments. And I find it ironic that this NASA pin that was given to me by a NASA employee was manufactured in China, of course. But a mission to Mars should not be a competition between nations. It should be a cooperative effort between all nations. And Martin Nowak, a Harvard professor, did some research on cooperation recently. He had an article in the Scientific American of July 2012 entitled The Evolution of Cooperation, where he basically summarized that competition and cooperation evolved together from the get-go. And in other words, you could say that we humans are as successful as we are because we have evolved to cooperate. And I think we need to be a little wiser about when to cooperate. Now, Catherine Newell lectures on religion and science down at the University of Miami. And 2 or 3 years ago, she asked a very pertinent question. She asked, should the exploration of Mars be portrayed as a triumph of global scientific cooperation? And that's exactly the question I think we should endeavor to answer with our actions. Now, in 2006, the NASA Ames Research Center held a conference made up of mostly younger people, and one of their major conclusions was that international collaboration is not only vital to sending humans to Mars, but should be one of the most important reasons for going in the first place. In other words, if we accomplish nothing else by sending humans to Mars, we should do it on an international cooperative basis in order to reduce some of this ridiculous conflict that we have going on in the world today. And I've noticed that several leaders in the space industry have begun to say basically the same thing, and that includes 4 NASA project leaders, Paul Hill, Robert Caswell, Michael Rafferty, and Patrick Troutman. And there are many examples going on of cooperation in space exploration today. The Mars Society obviously has participants coming here from all over the world. They recently had a shoulder name tag that included the flags of 8 different nations. And there was a simulated mission in 2012 in Moscow with a crew of Russians, Chinese, Frenchmen, and a Colombian. And the Russians at one point expressed a desire to have a joint Mars mission with the United States. And the ExoMars project is a cooperative effort between the Europeans and the Russians to send up a Mars orbiter lander in 2018. And the International Space Station has 16 nations participating, and the Russians have been providing transportation to it now for about 6 years. And the Chinese asked to join at one point, but the United States Congress excluded China, saying they would be a security risk. But I think that was a big mistake because the Chinese now have a viable, very viable program of their own. They've already launched a moon rover, an experimental space lab, and they have plans for a Mars rover and a space station. And they invite international cooperation from anyone who is interested. And Jan Verner, the European Space Agency director, recently made the comment that our globe deserves cooperation beyond national vanity and beauty contests. I think the United States needs to listen to that. And in the summer of 2012, about 2 weeks before the Mars Curiosity rover landed on Mars, I did a random survey on the streets of Northwest Arkansas, and I found that 47 people out of 50 didn't know anything about the Mars Curiosity rover, and that tells me that a humans to Mars mission would draw much more interest from the general public than any robotic mission. I did another at random street survey in 2015 where I asked 200 people in 8 central U.S. states if they thought a worldwide cooperative humans to Mars mission would be a good idea. And 34.5% said no. And 65.5% said yes. And I think that tells us that probably there's much more interest in the general public to have an international cooperative humans to Mars mission than most of us realize. Now, I did another survey this summer, mostly between Arkansas and Irvine. As I drove here, I stopped and surveyed people. And it's based on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that basically says that there's some indication that the words we use affect our perceptions. And I asked, altogether, I did 2 surveys. I asked 302 people, basically, what do you think is the best term we should use for others living around the world? And the first choice was global citizen. That was the most popular. Second choice, world citizens. Third choice, Earth citizens. And there were some people that got upset about the whole idea. But I must say that a lot of those folks that got upset had supernatural belief systems. And Jeffrey Bennett, an astrophysicist, wrote a book entitled The Essential Cosmic Perspective. And in that book, one of the main themes was, and he wrote this, we can grow up and solve our problems only by exploring the universe beyond the Earth. That's a pretty strong statement, but I checked with him in person about 3 years ago, and he stands by that statement. So an internationally supported Humans to Mars mission should invite every nation to participate in whatever level they're capable of. Perhaps it might be sweeping a floor somewhere. And every continent needs to be represented in some manner by a crew member. And all of the proceedings need to be translated into all the major languages of the world so that everyone feels included. And it could be the ultimate live television report from the crew as they leave the Earth, approach Mars, walk on the red dust of our next door planet Mars, and then begin to return to the Earth. I think such a live television report from the crew would inspire all humanity. So, an internationally supported Humans to Mars mission can help civilize Earth in these ways: encourage worldwide science education, cultivate a global human identity core, help us stop wasting so much money on anti-human weaponry, and give everyone a new look at the reality of our human place in the universe. And in the end, it could be a journey to peace and knowledge for all humanity. Do we have time for any questions? Yes.
Do you think there's a step beyond being a citizen of the planet that would be being a citizen of the cosmos? Because we're going to find life out there somewhere, if not on Mars, somewhere. And how would that affect the way we respond to that discovery, either as competitors, colleagues,
Well, I think
ventures?
that points out the same thing I found out when I did a survey asking people, are you an Earthling? And some people would answer, like, for instance, one young woman said, I'd rather be called a mammal. And people who had supernatural belief systems, they didn't like the term Earthling. They didn't want to be called Earthlings. And some people pointed out, well, crickets and cows and dogs are all Earthlings. So I think what we need is a term that would kind of, at least for the time being, be a commonality between the inhabitants of Earth, to sort of have a term that would include everyone, instead of using these human identities we have that separate us. You know, some people say, I'm this religion, and somebody says, well, I'm that religion, and we're going to get rid of you. Something like that.
That's going to happen on an interplanetary scale, right? Until if we find other sentient beings out there.
Well, it might. I don't know. We don't even know if there's other beings out there yet or not. Yes?
If that's going to happen, yes. But if we don't get our own act together, it's certainly going to happen.
That's exactly my idea, is to get our own act together. And I must say, some of the conservative folks, like I can't remember which town it was. I stopped at a lot of different towns, but I asked these three really conservative, sorry to mention identities, but boy, they didn't like the whole idea. They looked at my choices of earthling names and global citizens and all that. I had to list, and they said, all three of them were sitting at this table in a restaurant, said, we don't like any of them. Yes.
Bring a little practicality into this. With no bucks, Rogers. We've been waiting 40 years for Congress to do something. Never happened. What they finally delivered was SLS. That won't get us to Mars without another few $1 billion in 30 years. It's the billionaires that are going to get us there first. The Bezos, the Richard Branson, the Elon Musks.
You know what? How many nations are there in the world? 180 or so?
182.
If they all get together and pitch in what they can afford, then we can afford to go. And right now, I think...
Kickstarter or something?
I'm sorry?
Somebody has to organize it. If it's not the U.S.
Yeah, we need to elect a JFK-type president. Oops. Any other question? Is that the end of my time? Okay, well, thank you.